The stages of listening to Boise State Public Radio podcasts. Step 1. Testing the waters. You tune into an episode or two. Nothing too serious. Step 2. You got a little hooked on one of those series like Extremely American or Scandalized, and now you're binging. No judgment, but you did listen to it in one day. Step 3. Now you're subscribed to a feed. You get notifications to your phone every time there's a new daily episode of The Connector or Idaho Matters. I see where this is going. Step 4. You realize how much time you're spending with Boise State Public Radio podcasts and the fact that it doesn't cost you a dime. Step 5. You decide to step up and support your podcast listening because you can, because you want to, not because you have to. All right, now's the time, you podcast fan you. Go to boisestatepublicradio.org and click donate to support your love of Boise State Public Radio podcast listening today.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, and it's the end of the year. So it's time for our Reporter Roundtable Year in Review, where we look back at the top stories that made Idaho headlines in 2024. And today, our panel includes James Dawson with Boise State Public Radio, Scott McIntosh, opinion editor with the Idaho Statesman, Clark Corbin with Idaho Capital Sun, and Melissa Davlin, host of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television. Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday, Gemma.
Happy Friday.
Okay. When we looked at all of the top stories that you all sent in, we asked you guys to gather what you thought were the top stories. Everyone had wildfires as their top stories on your list. So I want to start our conversation today there. And Jimmy, let me start with you. Can you give us an overview of the Wapiti fire and when this was?
Yeah, so this was started kind of in the evening of July 24th. This was about a couple miles south of Grand Jean, which for people who, are in Southwest Idaho might be familiar with it. It's kind of this really cool area in the Boise National Forest where you can go hiking, camping, all kinds of great outdoor activities around there. But this was kind of interesting because it was lightning struck, whereas a whole lot of wildfires are typically human caused. But this is, one of the fires that come to the forefront of our minds when we think back to 2024 and the wildfire season. So it burned almost 130,000 acres across the Boise National Forest, not to mention the Sawtooth National Forest. And then there were little bits in the Salmon Chalice National Forest. It really socked in Boise and the Treasure Valley, as well as sort of in the Sawtooth area and a little bit north of Boise, with a ton of smoke for weeks. Lots of, economic factors went into this, where communities like Stanley, for instance, were hit really hard by people not going camping and recreating during the summer like they normally do. Not to mention that this was just, a couple weeks after or around the same time as another fire that started near Redfish Lodge, which, threatened that pretty mainstay of summer culture around central Idaho as well, though that one was also eventually sort of beaten back and the lodge was saved, but there's still a nice burn scar there, as there is with this 130,000 acres as well.
So, Clark, as Jimmy mentioned, these two wildfires were not the only ones here in Idaho in 2024. Can you talk about some of the others that you covered and how the U.S. Army actually had to come in and help us out at one point?
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, I think as most everybody listening today will remember just how devastating a wildfire season that we had, fueled by hot and dry conditions. And I know the Wapiti fire, which Jimmy had talked about in the Grand Jean area, all up in that Highway 21 corridor, basically from Grand Jean and Loma and up to Stanley, was a major fire. And I covered a couple of other major fires as well, if you want to shift just a little bit west and think of the Highway 25 corridor that goes up near Lake Cascade and would continue on to McCall and Donnelly. I covered a series of fires out there in August and September that started after the Wapiti fire was already burning and spreading. And these fires had several different names. The Boulder Fire, the Dollar Fire, the Snag Fire, the Mountain West Complex Fire. But eventually there was extreme fire behavior in early September, and a new fire started called the Lava Fire. And it actually consumed all of those other fires in the area and became one giant fire that they just called the Lava Complex Fire moving forward. And that burned about 100,000 acres. And I went out there, I grabbed some fire resistant gear and went out there 2 different times to the lava fire right out near Lake Cascade. And the U.S. Army called in 250 active duty Army soldiers. Many of them were part of the 14th Brigade Engineer Battalion out of Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. And the reason this happened was because there was so much wildfire activity across the country that the federal government was essentially out of new crews to mobilize to come help put out these fires that were just one after another touching off in Idaho. So about 250 U.S. Army soldiers from Washington State came out. I met them. I shadowed them for 2 days as they fought the fires and really helped out. That number of soldiers provided 10 additional crews that were able to help fight these fires and ultimately help protect some of the homes along Brenda Drive, just right off the southern tip of Lake Cascade there. I actually, on the final day that I was watching them on September 11th, I hopped into a kind of a side-by-side four-wheel drive vehicle and went through the evacuation zone up and down Brenda Drive and watched as the firefighters connect their hoses and laid hoses all around cabins and sheds and properties and houses that had been evacuated. It's kind of one of the final things that they did. And it worked. The fire didn't spread and damage those homes. But I think that was my biggest takeaway. That was the first time that I had actually gone to the fire line and gotten that close to fires. But the takeaway of just the number and size of fires that we had all across the Western United States, here in Idaho, and the fact that the resources were so maxed out that they did call in 250 Army soldiers to help out. I know there were more than 1,000 people at one point fighting the lava fire. There were similar numbers fighting the Wapiti fire. But I think that was, my experience was just the number and size of these fires and how significant it was for so many people in the state of Idaho there, Gemma.
Mm-hmm. And Melissa, you also said it was a really bad wildfire. In fact, you've got some numbers to share with us. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. There are a lot of different ways you can measure a fire season's intensity. Like Clark said, the amount of resources, the acres burned, like Jimmy mentioned, Wapiti was at nearly 130,000 acres, but that's not the biggest fire even in that area in the last 20 years. Halstead was, I think, almost 180,000. But another way to measure that is air quality. And through the EPA, you can download data on air quality in any given area where they measure going back more than 20 years. And I'll skip the nitty gritty details, but basically in recent years, the Boise area has had roughly, 4 to 10 days that have had unhealthy air quality every year, where they recommend people avoid strenuous exercise, high-risk populations stay out inside, that kind of thing. Sometimes that can be because of inversions in smog, but during Idaho summers, that almost always means wildfire, as we know. We had more than 30 days this year in the unhealthy or higher quality category, with some in the very unhealthy zone. That's the highest amount since the EPA started plotting this in the Boise area. And I didn't even get a chance to look at other areas in Idaho that were very much affected by this because, again, Orofino was hit hard. Lewiston and Moscow were hit hard. Stanley, obviously, right there at Wapiti. Those unhealthy air quality days also went longer into the season than they normally do. We know that fire seasons are hotter and drier and longer now. And so, you can look at any given metric though for this fire season. That's just one that stood out to me because it doesn't matter if you live in the, urban wildland interface or in the forest, those unhealthy air quality days affect everyone in Idaho.
So I want to switch gears for a minute because Scott, you had the Boise hangar collapse on your top stories list. Remind us what happened here and frankly what we've learned since then.
Yeah, and this is really probably one of the most tragic stories of the
Yeah.
year, and it happened back in January 31st. This was a hangar that was under construction at the Boise airport, and it collapsed, resulting in the deaths of 3 workers and injuries to 9 other people at the site. The hangar was intended to be a large steel structure spanning 300 feet. And, the videos and the photos just really did not do this justice. The hangar was right alongside the freeway along Interstate 84. And so people who you drive by this and you realize how massive this thing really was. But it was part of an expansion project to provide additional space for aircraft storage and maintenance for the Jackson Jet Center at the Boise Airport. And while it was under construction, it collapsed and killing those 3 folks and injuring 9 others. The victims of the collapse were Craig Durant, co-founder of Big D Builders, and 2 construction workers from Guatemala who were living in Nampa at the time of the accident. And then the Occupational Safety and Health Administration launched an investigation. They found that the contractor, Big D Builders, had ignored some critical safety standards. The company failed to install necessary bracing and tension guy wires, leaving the structure unstable and leading to its collapse. And sadly, unfortunately, workers had previously reported visible warning signs, such as bent rafters and snapped cables, but those warning signs were overlooked, leading up to the collapse. And then as a result of that investigation, OSHA cited Big D Builders for multiple safety violations, proposing nearly $200,000 in fines. And in addition, individual civil lawsuits brought by the families of the killed construction workers are also pending at this time. So yeah, really one of the saddest stories of the year.
So Clark, one of the biggest stories of the year that maybe wasn't as, flashy as some of the other news was the water curtailment settlement and what led up to it. Can you take us through that from the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. This was a major story all throughout this year, Gemma, and really has been a major story for decades. But it's also a story that folks that live in cities and suburbs, they may not have missed, or it may not have affected them directly, and they may not be as aware of it. And there's just one thing that I want to ask folks to keep in mind when we get into it. And when we're talking about water rights, the oldest water rights have precedent over the newest water rights. So if your company or if your ancestors secured water rights in the 1920s, those are going to have priority over companies or families that maybe got their water rights in the 1950s or 1960s, if that makes sense. So the oldest in time have priority. And after decades of court battles and discussions and disputes, the Department of Water Resources issued a water curtailment order in May of this year, and it affected about 6,400 junior groundwater rights holders who pump their water off the Eastern Snake Plain aquifer. And so what it meant was they had to shut their water off to protect the water for the people that had the older water rights that had priority. And this didn't affect, Gemma, their drinking water supply, but the issue came in for farmers, and it happened right in the middle of irrigation system. And the problem is that the farmers had already paid for all of their investments. They put their crops in the ground in the spring, and right before the irrigation season and the growing season would have turned on, there was this water curtailment that had them shut their water off. I talked with farmers in eastern Idaho who were worried that this was going to put them out of business, that this was going to dry up like 500,000 acres of agriculture land in eastern Idaho, and it could have all these effects beyond just the individual family farmers affected. It could affect other producers, transportation companies. It could affect food availability. And so what this led to was when the curtailment order was issued, Governor Little issued an executive order as well, and basically asked the two sides to go to the negotiating table and come up with a new water negotiating plan. It took several months, but initially they resolved the dispute for this year, and they ended the curtailment order. But then they continued to negotiate, Jim, even through the harvest season, to come up with a new long-term agreement that both sides signed off on. It became official just over a month ago, on or about November 15th. And this is a new 4-year agreement. And the two sides that I talked to said that they like this new deal because there's not going to be this unexpected curtailment order that comes up in the middle of a growing season where they've got their crops in the ground and then they have to shut off their water and risk spoiling their crops. So instead, this passes out water in 4-year increments, and folks can plan, have a predictable amount of water, and they'll be protected for curtailment if they adhere to the basic agreement that's in place between the two sides. So it was a really hectic, chaotic summer for farmers, but it resulted in them going back to the negotiation table. The new agreement ended the lawsuits, it ended curtailment, and it breaks water into 4-year allotments moving forward. So there's some planning and predictability that the two sides are optimistic will be in the new deal going forward. So a hectic and chaotic year on the waterfront, but there is a new long-term agreement, Gemma, that came as a result of this fight.
And Scott, you put the failed execution of Thomas Creech on your list. So give us some background first. Who is Thomas Creech, and then what happened this year?
Yeah, Thomas Creech is a longtime death row inmate. He's been on death row in Idaho since 1983, since he was convicted for the brutal murder of a fellow inmate in prison, David Jensen. Now, Creech has been convicted of other murders and accused of other crimes. He's admitted other murders that he hasn't even been tried for. But he was on death row. He had a death sentence for the murder of David Jensen. And the execution was planned for February 28th of this year at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. I served as a media witness to that execution at the prison. And watched for an hour as the medical team, the execution team, tried to establish an IV that was needed to administer the lethal injection, but they were unsuccessful. They tried multiple times to access veins in Creech's arms and legs and his ankles, but they could not proceed. And so after an hour, that led to the cancellation of the execution. And then we were escorted out, and Creech was brought back to his cell. This was Idaho's first execution attempt in over 12 years, really kind of highlighting the ongoing difficulties in obtaining the necessary lethal injection drugs. In response to those challenges, Idaho actually, in the meantime, has legalized the firing squad as an alternative execution method. But those facilities for this method are still under development. They haven't been able to build a facility and have trouble finding contractors to build a firing squad facility. But the state apparently is getting these lethal injection drugs now. But Creech's legal team has been filing appeals, arguing that any further attempts would violate his constitutional rights against cruel and unusual punishment. He was actually scheduled for another execution attempt on November 13th, but that was also called off after a U.S. district judge issued a stay granted to allow for legal challenges related to Creech's case, particularly concerning a new clemency hearing. So that is all pending and still going on. There have been, in the meantime, no immediate plans announced for another attempt, but that continues to be an issue in Idaho.
Yeah. And so at this point, Scott, as you said, we don't know when or if this execution of Creech will even go through.
Right. It's still going through the courts. The state is still trying to secure lethal injection drugs for another attempt. And The Department of Correction has made changes to its execution procedures, including the establishment of a new execution preparation room where a central line can be used if peripheral IV access fails. And just for full disclosure, my newspaper, the Idaho Statesman, along with the Associated Press and East Idaho News, are suing the Idaho Department of Correction over those new protocols, arguing that they're not transparent enough. So again, that will be another issue if there is another execution that is scheduled in the near future.
Okay, thanks for that update. So, Melissa, I have to say, there may have been more coverage of abortion here in Idaho, and not just on a local or state, but we're talking even a national level. Probably, it seems, at least here in Idaho, almost on any other topic. Because if you look at the ongoing effects of Idaho's abortion ban, and then you have the EMTALA lawsuit going before the U.S. Supreme Court. So, can you take us through the top stories in regards to abortion here in Idaho in 2024?
I'll keep it top level and then talk about
Yeah.
the ongoing effects. But a lot did happen in the courts, as you mentioned, and continues to happen as these multiple cases are making their way through federal and district court over both the abortion ban and whether it conflicts with the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. That went before the U.S. Supreme Court. And also the trafficking law that says that non-custodial adults can't transport minors across state lines for an abortion without permission. The EMTALA case that went before the U.S. Supreme Court is now back in federal court. That case was argued in earlier this month. And all of these laws are still in place as these cases are making their way through the system. Ultimately, the 2024 legislature didn't do anything to address some of these gray areas in the law, things that could address some of the concerns that the Department of Justice raised with the abortion ban and whether it does conflict with EMTALA. Basically, the Department of Justice argues, as a refresher, that sometimes doctors need to perform an abortion on a pregnant patient as stabilizing care. And that is to comply with a federal law that says any hospital that receives Medicare funds must adhere to this EMTALA Act. And they say that Idaho's ban, the language in the statute is so strict, it only covers exemptions for life of the mother, as well as reported rape and incest. But it doesn't, they argue that it doesn't include stabilizing care for the health of the mother, that sometimes they need to stabilize the mother, end a pregnancy, even if the patient isn't on death's door. There have been a lot of lawmakers who have been talking behind the scenes, some of them on the record to journalists, saying we really need to address this. Maybe we can put in language in the statute saying that abortions are okay when it is in these circumstances. The Attorney General and the state of Idaho have argued in court and have said to the press that they can't imagine a scenario in which they would prosecute a doctor for performing an abortion in good faith if a woman's health was that gravely at risk. Ultimately, though, those gray areas still exist, and the legislature, I don't think, will address them, certainly not this incoming legislature, until the courts do. And at the end of the day, the biggest thing that affects women, doctors are continuing to leave the profession in Idaho, and it's getting harder and harder to recruit doctors to work in the state. There are job postings for OBGYNs in every part of the state that I looked at. And that means it's harder to get gynecological care even if you aren't pregnant. And, for women who are trying to schedule annual exams, it's
It's
a
tough.
long time out.
Yeah.
And it didn't, we have a growing population. We have increased demands on the medical system as it is. And now we have fewer and fewer gynecologists who are able to treat women for basic gynecological care, even if they aren't pregnant. And so this has compounding effects for patients, even if they aren't pregnant or planning to get pregnant.
All right. Appreciate that update, Melissa. So, Jimmy, transgender issues also made a lot of headlines here in the Gem State, from a care ban making it to the Idaho Supreme Court, all the way to Boise State University volleyball. So can we start with Idaho's law that banned gender-affirming care for minors? Tell us about that.
Yeah, and for that one, we have to go back to the 2023 legislative session when lawmakers Past that ban that was set to take effect on January 1st, 2024. It did not, due to a last minute federal court injunction. However, when April came around, that's when the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in and said that this law can go into effect after all, aside from the named plaintiffs in the lawsuit. And that's significant not only on an Idaho level, which then meant that any transgender youth who was not part of that lawsuit could no longer get their gender affirming care, which include, puberty blockers, cross sex hormones, things like that. But also, that was the basis for the Supreme Court saying, hey, these lower court injunctions all across the country have grown so broad, as opposed to just narrowly tailoring themselves to the parties and plaintiffs who are filing these suits, and we need to rein them in. So that's had downstream effects all across the country. But this case is still going on, where transgender youth are having a hard time accessing the medical care they view as necessary to treat their gender dysphoria. Some are going to Oregon or other states to get them right now. Some families are moving out of Idaho to get them. The U.S. Supreme Court also just a few weeks ago, or a couple months ago, during their latest session, heard arguments on a Tennessee law that is pretty similar. And from media reports, they seem to think that the Supreme Court is leaning towards upholding these bans across the states. So it's still kind of in a wait and see mode, but that's where we're at with that particular ban.
Okay, so then let's go to Boise State volleyball, Jimmy. How did college volleyball end up before a federal judge?
Yeah, I mean, this is another kind of downstream effect from another Idaho law passed in 2020, which was going to make it illegal for schools, whether they were public high schools or middle schools, or even colleges and universities, to allow transgender women to participate on sports teams that align with their gender identity. The NCAA, which is kind of the top level sports league or sports organization for collegiate athletes, they have left this, sort of carve out for different sports to make their own decisions at the international level, and they would take guidance from there as to whether or not transgender athletes would be allowed to participate. Volleyball is one of those, where if you are have received gender affirming care for at least a year and your testosterone levels are under a certain threshold, then you are allowed to play on a women's team. Well, the San Jose State Spartans have a transgender player who has not come out publicly, but certainly has been the topic of conversation on right-wing media outlets as being this superhuman creature who can hit the ball, quote, upwards of 80 miles an hour, which, by the way, would make it almost the same amount or the same speed as the top recorded international men's spike speed, which I've spoken to several different volleyball experts who say that that's just not true and not possible. Anyway, there were several schools within the Mountain West Conference, including Boise State, who forfeited to San Jose State. Boise State did so 3 times, 2 during the regular season, and again in the semifinal matchup during the Mountain West Conference Championship. The reason why this was in front of a federal judge was because a few volleyball players in these schools, including the co-captain of the San Jose Spartans, 2 Boise State volleyball players, and even a university filed suit to get San Jose State disqualified from the Mountain West Conference championship, which a federal judge in Colorado declined to do, basically saying it was filed at the last minute and that that would completely upend the entire tournament just days before it was set to take place. San Jose State did not win. They did make it to the finals, but Colorado State ended up winning, and they're the ones who go to the NCAA volleyball tournament nationally.
So here's another story that made pretty much everybody's list today. And Scott, you described it as Proposition 1 goes down in flames. So, Clark, let's start first by you describing one more time what Prop 1 is, or I guess I should say what Prop 1 was.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to do it. And then I know everyone else can kind of talk about the breakdown and the ramifications. But Proposition 1 was a ballot initiative, which in Idaho, a ballot initiative is a form of direct democracy where the voters of Idaho, not the Idaho legislature, decide on whether or not we should pass a new law. And it was defeated big time in the November general election. Like Scott said, it went down in flames by a margin of 70-30. But what it would have done is it would have made pretty sweeping changes, Gemma, to both primary elections in the state of Idaho and the general election. And just a quick and dirty summary, it would have ended the closed primary election that we've had in the state of Idaho since about 2011. And instead of these closed party primary elections, it would have had one primary election that would have been open to all voters and all candidates across the state, regardless of party affiliation. And then from that primary, the top 4 candidates with the most votes would advance to the general election. And then when we get to the general election, Prop 1 would have created something called ranked choice voting, where voters would have the option to rank the candidates in order of preference. They vote for their favorite, and then they could have had the option to rank them second, third, and fourth choice, with the candidate with the fewest amount of votes being eliminated, and then their votes transferred to the next highest ranked active remaining candidate. It failed big time. It was rejected by voters in Idaho. And so as a result, there will be no changes to any of Idaho's election laws. That was kind of the quick and dirty of what it would have done. But I want to step aside and let either Scott or Melissa kind of talk about the ramifications and kind of the breakdown there, Gemma.
Yeah, Scott, let me go to you, because the Idaho Statesman actually came out with an editorial before the election about how Prop 1 would change Idaho politics for the better, is what the Statesman said. So what would have been the benefits had it passed?
I think first and foremost, we argued that it would have provided broader voter participation. So like Clark said, currently the Republican primary is closed, and you kind of essentially have a taxation without representation system where unaffiliated voters in particular, and there's about 280,000 people who don't register with a party, they pay for their closed Republican primary with their tax dollars, but they can't participate in it. So this open primary, if it had passed, would have allowed all voters, regardless of party, regardless of affiliation, to vote in the primary. The other argument that we made was that it would have reduced extremism. By opening up the primaries to all voters, candidates would need to appeal to a broader electorate, potentially reducing the influence of extremist candidates who currently win with a small partisan voter base. Already, primary elections have fewer voters in them. And then when you limit it even further with only people who are registered in the Republican Party, you're talking about sometimes just a couple thousand votes in deciding a primary election. And so the open primary, again, would have opened that up, and you probably have greater participation. And then it would have mitigated hyperpartisanship. There's a fear of being primaried by more radical candidates in a primary now. And that would be lessened because, as Clark said, you'd have the top 4 moving on to the general election. So even if you don't get the most votes and you're appealing to a broader base, you have less fear in legislating to pass an abortion ban or to ban transgender care, or pass the library book ban and bounty bill, that you'd have less fear of that in that new system. And so, like Clark said, it went down 70-30%. And so we're still going to have the same system that we've got.
So while we're talking about elections, Melissa, I know you wanted to talk about how the elections really shook up the upcoming Idaho legislature, in particular, Senator Chuck Winder losing his primary. So will this, Melissa, have a big impact on policy moving forward? And Jimmy, you should jump in as well, because you also cover the legislature.
It's going to have huge impacts on policy. That the primary election results. I mean, Senator Winder was the president pro tem of the Senate, and in that position, he had a lot of say over what proposals went to what committees, who was heading those committees. He could put people who agreed with him on things like public money going to private school tuition. He was opposed to that. There are a lot of people in the legislature who want some form of, whether it's school choice or vouchers or whatever form that bill comes in, that is much more likely now to happen. It's not that Senator Winder could had ultimate control over the chamber, and the legislature did things that he disagreed with multiple times, including intervening in the Idaho Transportation Department property sale. But now that Senator Anthon is the president pro tem, it's going to be a very, very different Senate, I think. There were also a lot of people who lost their primaries. Clark was talking about the importance of water to Idaho. There were a whole lot of Magic Valley lawmakers who were very involved in water issues who lost their primaries to people who I'll say water isn't their top priority when they're talking about their campaign issues. You look at their website and they're a lot more concerned about social issues and education, that kind of thing. And that's who those voters chose to send to Boise. But that is going to have a very big effect, I think, on where the legislature goes on things like education and water policy.
And Jimmy, your thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I think Melissa and Clark covered it pretty well, but there were several districts where you had longtime lawmakers. I'm thinking, especially in Elmore County, for example, where you had an entire complete shakeup of those three legislators who lost their primaries and will be represented by a set of new people who are far more conservative than even those who were already conservative representing those areas. So you've got all of these downstream effects with committee assignments, new committee chairs, the whole tax credit or student voucher issue, passed a different version passed the Senate last year, but it failed in the House, for example, or didn't get past the House, and then the House didn't want to take up the tax credit issue within committee. All of those things are in play now, certainly with this new legislative crowd that we're going to have in just a few weeks.
So, Jimmy, another top story you had was the library bill. So remind us about this bill.
Yeah, so this bill is one that essentially anyone, no matter where they live, they do not have to live in Idaho, can petition a library in Idaho, whether it's a public library, a K through 12 school library, even a private school library. They can petition them. And within 60 days of receiving this complaint, a library will have to move that particular, whether it's a video or a book or a magazine, whatever it happens to be, will have to move that material to an adults only section within 60 days. So if they refuse to remove that material, then the person filing the complaint would be able to sue in civil court. You get a minimum of $250 fine plus whatever actual damages might have occurred. Say, your child saw this book and, you could sue for emotional turmoil or whatever it happens to be. Now, this bill was fairly similar to one that Governor Little vetoed in 2023. His quote from that veto letter was, quote, "This legislation makes sweeping blanket assumptions on materials that could be determined as harmful to minors in a local library, and it will force one interpretation of that phrase onto all other patrons of the library." That language was still in there in the bill that he decided to sign. And basically he said, when we asked him about that, he said, well, the bill's sponsor, Representative Jaron Crane, He worked really hard on this, and he took my suggestions to make it a little bit better. And so I don't want to, act in bad faith, was basically what he said. We've seen some effects of this over the summer and into the fall as well, with libraries across the state either putting like a big stop sign, like, hey, if you're under 18, do not go into this section. Some libraries have floated even having to completely exclude children who are unaccompanied by their parents, having different tiered system of library cards where parents can choose whether or not certain books are able to be checked out. It's a whole lot of things, and we've seen some challenges, for example, in Boise, some kind of troll ones. The first one was against the Bible, for example, that got thrown out, but there have been several that have been considered as well across the state, and I imagine that will only become more significant as we move into the future.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so I want to quickly get to our speed round so that we can get to a couple of more stories. Clark, I'm going to start with you. Quagga mussels. Tell us about this.
Yeah, for sure. These are these tiny little invasive species, Gemma, that were first discovered in the Snake River in Idaho near Twin Falls, literally right under Shoshone Falls in Twin Falls. They were discovered in September 2023, and the state launched a pretty aggressive campaign of dumping a copper-based chemical in the Snake River, an attempt to kill off all of the quagga mussels. And it actually led to a lot of dead fish in the Snake River as well. Fast forward to this year, and when they resumed testing again in September, they discovered more of the invasive species quagga mussels in the Snake River, in and around Twin Falls and Shoshone Falls. The state has continued to try to treat the river. Their goal is to eliminate every last quagga mussel, which they detected in water samples. It's these tiny little microscopic villagers, the larva stage that they're looking for. And really the concern is that they're not native to Idaho and they reproduce quickly. And so in places like Lake Mead, where the mussels have festered and expanded greatly, they can clog drain pipes, they can overwhelm docks and dams and boats and things like that. So there's a concern that if it's not addressed, that it could have major water quality issues. It could clog infrastructure for drinking water and irrigation, and really kind of be a drain and a nuisance on the state. We don't know, because of the temperatures and the water sampling, we don't know if they succeeded in killing off all the quagga mussels, but they will continue to treat the river, and Gemma continue to do more testing next year when the water warms up to try to see if the programs were effective. But it's something that Fish and Game and the Department of Agriculture are very, very concerned about, Gemma. So a lot of people are following those invasive mussels.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, Ruth Brown over at your shop had a story about the effects of parental rights legislation. Quickly tell us about this.
Yeah, over the summer, she was talking to a nurse who mentioned that their attorneys informed them that as they read the new parental rights legislation passed by the 24 legislature that basically says that without parental consent, doctors cannot provide medical treatment to minors unless it's an emergency situation. That means that that nurses who are helping patients who say that they have been sexually assaulted cannot perform sexual assault exams or administer rape kits to minors without parental permission. And, unfortunately, sometimes the accused, the perpetrator, might be somebody who is related to them, a stepfather. Sometimes they can't get that permission from a guardian because they don't believe that their partner or a family member could do something like that. And so there are very real effects on sexual assault investigations and evidence collecting if they can't perform those exams. Lawmakers who sponsored the bill said that wasn't their intent. I don't know if they are going to revisit it this year, but I know that there are a lot of Democratic lawmakers who are interested in addressing it.
Well, I want to thank all of you so much for being our panel today on our Reporter Roundtable Year in Review. A big thank you to James Dawson with Boise State Public Radio, Scott McIntosh, opinion editor with the Idaho Statesman, Clark Corbin with the Idaho Capital Sun, and Melissa Davlin, host of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television. And we want to thank all of our other reporters who so generously come on the Roundtable every Friday. We so appreciate all of you, and I want to just give out some of their time to make sure that, they keep all of us updated on the headlines in Idaho. So a big thank you to all of them. And we should point out that our reporters on our Roundtable, they do not get paid to come on here. They are donating their time, their energy to bring you all a glimpse of the great stories that we do every single year. So be sure to check out all of their reporting. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.